The Nevada high desert wakes slowly in early spring, the kind of morning when frost clings to sagebrush and the mountains wear a faint ribbon of pink like they're remembering winter one last time. Wild Haven Mustang Sanctuary sits snug in a fold of those mountains. An old dairy barn refit with clean stalls and soft lighting. A web of pipe corrals outside. Trails sketched by hooves through rabbit brush and low juniper. The air smells like alfalfa, molasses, and coal dust. Abby Carter tucks a stray strand of hair back under her beanie and checks the mare on stall 7 again. Luna's breath purls in white clouds. Her flanks ripple with the slow, tidal work of birth. Abby is 29, Wyoming-born, and broad-shouldered in the way of women who carry hay bales without thinking about it. She has a way of walking that horses trust. Quiet feet, steady shoulders, hands that say it'll be all right without moving much at all. She's been up since midnight, since Luna started pacing and nest-building with impatient little pawings at the straw. Now the contractions are deep, more focused. Luna lifts her head, nostrils flaring, and pins Abby with a look that is half plea and half iron resolve. I'm here, Abby thinks. Right here. Helen Grady, the sanctuary director, leans on the stall door with a thermos steaming in her hand. Her gray braid is tucked into a quilted coat, her eyes fox-sharp even at dawn. You see how she's shifting her weight? We're close. Yeah, Abby says, voice low, the words settling like a blanket. She's got this. A wind brushes the big sliding barn doors and makes the rope halters on their pegs whisper together. Far off, a coyote tests a yip, then shuts up as if embarrassed. The sky is a wide porcelain bowl, and a few flakes of leftover winter drift out of nowhere, glittering in the aisle light like dust motes with secrets. Luna grunts, bears down, and the world narrows to muscle and time. Abby kneels into the straw, not touching, only watching, counting her own breaths to keep from intruding. The bag appears, silver blue under the warm bulbs, the foal's front feet white-boned within. Then a nose, slick and perfect. The little one tumbles into Abby's hands as if this was always the plan. Shoulders, hips, the soft collapse of new life onto straw. Abby tears the sack with practiced fingers and clears the nostrils. The foal coughs once, shakes his head like a wet dog, then breathes. Luna curls around with a sound that is both ancient and brand new, a note pulled from a place older than wind. Look at that coloring, Helen murmurs. Would you believe it? Silver dapple. Under the barn lights, it looks like snow fallen on dark water. Dapples with a misty sheen, mane stump already a shade paler than his neck. The sanctuary staff had joked for weeks about what Luna would bring them. A firecracker? Asleep all day? Abby hadn't let herself wish for anything other than healthy. But this is a secret you can see. He's up in minutes. That's normal for a Mustang, born with a clock in their bones that understands coyotes and cold. But there's something about the way he tries his legs that is not the frantic scramble Abby expects. He places each foot like it belongs to a plan. The first time he sags, he pauses, assesses the drift of his knees as if they were someone else's property, and he's returning them in better condition. Then he rises again, steadier. His ears swivel. He looks at Luna, then at Abby, and holds her eyes for a second longer than colts tend to tolerate. Hi there, Abby breathes. You're all right. He blinks, a slow, deliberate click. Then he studies the stall, boards, bucket, the black tie ring bolted at chest height, like a surveyor mapping a lot line. When Luna nudges him toward the udder, he follows, though not with the blind fumbling she's used to seeing. He glances at the angle of her hind leg, then at the straw depth under his feet, sidesteps once, and latches on. Helen's grin shows the ghost of the girl she must have been. Milk bars open. The generator hiccups, lights flicker, and the barn goes dim for a breath. Outside, the late flurry thickens, soft taps against the tin roof. Miguel, the night tech, pops his head around the corner with a flashlight. "All good?" "We're good," Abby says. "He's nursing." They watch. They breathe. The rhythm in the barn changes from labor to lullaby. Abby checks the umbilicus, towels the foal's shoulders, and scoops a fresh ring of straw to keep drafts off Luna's hips. She's done this dozens of times, and still it feels like a small moonrise every single birth. But it's more than awe that pricks at her. It's curiosity. The colt, she tries the word like a test drive, keeps looking. Not the distracted newborn stare. No. This is a sweep, a scan. Like he's cataloging the moving parts. People. Halters, the squeak of Helen's boot. He holds that eye contact again, not in challenge, not in fear, but with something that reminds Abby of the kitchen table at her dad's ranch. The way he'd look at a busted cinch and already be thinking through the best splice. Miguel laughs softly under his breath. Little guy's got opinions. The colt finishes and stands, milk smeared and beaming in the dull way new things shine. He pivots toward the door gap, where the aisle opens to the corral outside. The wind sneaks a cold line across the floor. He rocks back, decides he doesn't care for that draft, and leans into Luna's chest as if to tuck her leg in closer, a gentle press that any other mare might ignore. Luna adjusts. The draft lessens. Abby's eyebrows climb before she can help it. "Did you see that?" Helen says. "Yeah." They name him before breakfast. Names don't always stick on day one, but this one comes from a simple, shared fact. They don't yet understand him. Cipher. It's a joke first, then not a joke at all. Helen writes it on the whiteboard and underlines it once. Abby writes it in her journal in block letters she hasn't used since high school. Cipher's next test arrives by accident. A feed cart wheel snags a flattened water hose and yanks it sideways, bumping the latch on the stall across from Luna's. The latch doesn't open, but it lifts, clanks, and drops. Cipher turns so fast Abby notices the decision more than the motion. He doesn't spook. He notes the sound, scans the latch on his own door, then steps away from it like he's choosing not to repeat a mistake he hasn't made. He angles his ears at the feed buckets hung just high enough to keep a curious mouth out. He measures their distance the way a carpenter measures a cut. Twice. "You're 3 minutes old," Abby whispers, smiling. "Slow down." He blinks. That careful click again. By noon, the sun is out. A bright coin skipped across the snow patches until they surrender and sink into mud. The volunteers drift in on their Saturday rotation, voices lowered by instinct as they pass the stall. Wild Haven isn't a petting zoo. It's a halfway house for old injuries and bad stories, for horses that found themselves in the wrong auction yard or at the end of a rope that had no business being there. But everyone gets a look. Luna accepts the attention like a queen who pardoned 3 peasants before lunch. Cipher watches without the flit of nerves most foals can't help. He stays placed, balanced over his small hooves, tracking people one by one. When Abby reaches in to scratch the damp curl at the base of his mane, he leans into it, then out, then into it again, calibrating pressure the way you'd calibrate a scale. Helen brings the scale, because of course she does. Cipher steps onto it with a hitch of curiosity and zero fuss. Abby calls out the number and logs it. She notes the time he stood, the time he first latched, the time he peed, the time he dozed, and now this. Duration of sustained eye contact, 4 seconds, repeated. Response to novel sound, investigatory, not reactive. Locomotion, deliberate, measured, symmetrical. Miguel squints at the page. You starting a thesis? I'm just not letting this be one of those things we swear happened and can't prove later. In the afternoon, the wind freshens and scatters the last of the flurry into memory. Abby takes Luna and Cipher out to the small recovery pen where the ground bumps gently and a shelter throws its shade like an elbow. The colt moves like he's thinking about where to put each piece of himself. He pauses at the threshold of sunshine, squints, then steps into the warmth and lifts his head to it. He tilts an ear toward the busy cornerstone of the barn. Clatter, voices, a radio faint as a mosquito, and then toward the quiet seam of the hills. He chooses the hills. Good choice, Abby says. A red-tailed hawk slides the sky open above them. The colt watches it the way a chess player watches a gambit, interest without fear. Luna grazes the first green stubble and blows softly into his flank, as if to say, don't overthink it. He samples the world in small bites. Sagebrush scent, a mouthful of straw he decides against, the cool pulse of water in the automatic trough. He studies the trough lip, the lever inside, the way water wakes when a nose presses just so. He touches the lever, flinches at the burble, then, after a heartbeat that looks suspiciously like reconsideration, presses again. Back in the barn at dusk, Abby slides the stall door and catches that latch with her palm, feeling the spring weight. Cipher is already watching. His eyes meet hers, and she can't help it. Don't, she says, half laughing. Not today. He doesn't. He stands. He thinks. He breathes like the barn breathes, in tide with Luna's ribcage. When he finally drops into straw, it's not a collapse so much as a negotiated surrender. He folds each leg under like an origami note. He stares at the tie ring one last time and then closes his eyes. Miguel clicks the radio off in the office. The generator thrums, steady now. The cold comes down clean and honest. Helen hangs a hand-lettered sign at the end of the aisle for visitors in the morning. Please keep voices down, new life resting. Abby lingers. She knows better than to bring too much of her own heart into the barn. But horses make pickpockets of the best intentions. She watches the tiny bellows at Cipher's nostrils, the slow quiver of his whiskers as straw tickles a dream he hasn't had yet. Luna lifts her head and looks at Abby. The mare's eyes are steady, dark as wet soil, and for a weird second, Abby feels weighed and measured in return. Okay, Abby says, the word barely a breath. We'll see. On her way out, she scribbles one last line in the journal. A sentence she will cross out twice and write again tomorrow because it sounds foolish and exactly right at the same time. The colt moves with intent. The colt observes before he acts. The colt sees you. In the night outside, coyotes keep their distance. The wind trades stories with the mountains and leaves the barn alone. Wildhaven sleeps, but not the kind of sleep that forgets. It's the kind that keeps one ear open, one candle lit, as if the desert itself has decided to wait up and listen for whatever Cipher will do next. 3 days after his birth, the desert morning was already crisp enough to make Abby's breath hang in the barn aisle. The sun was just beginning to slide between the peaks, laying pale gold stripes across the stalls. Luna dozed with one hip cocked, her silver-dappled foal curled near her forelegs. Abby was halfway through her morning feed rounds when she heard it, the soft, metallic click of a latch. Her head snapped toward stall 7. Cipher stood there, muzzle still against the latch as it swung open. He didn't bolt or push his way out. Instead, he stepped back and looked at her, steady, deliberate. Then he turned, ears flicking toward Luna's feed bucket. It was empty. Abby froze for a beat, realizing she had somehow skipped Luna's feed. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, striding over. Cipher held his ground as she poured the flakes of alfalfa into the bucket. Only when Luna dipped her head to eat did he return to her side. Abby closed the latch, double-checking it this time, but her pulse was still skipping. Foals didn't do this, not without some trial and error, not without random play. He had acted with clear purpose. She made a note in her journal right then. Cipher opened stall latch, directly indicated empty bucket. No escape attempt. By midday, the barn was busier. Volunteers were repairing fence lines along the southern paddock after the winter winds had knocked them askew. Abby was restocking mineral blocks when she heard an insistent, rhythmic snort behind her. Turning, she saw Cipher at the gate to the turnout pen. He stamped a forefoot, flicked his head toward the pasture beyond, then looked back at her. "What now?" she murmured. He repeated the gesture, more urgent. Abby followed him through the gate. Halfway across the pen, she saw the problem. Maple, an older mare recovering from a leg injury, had wandered too close to a sagging section of wire. One hind leg was caught between the bottom two strands, the barbs pressing dangerously against her skin. "Whoa, girl!" Abby called softly, approaching. Maple's eyes rolled, nostrils flaring, but she stayed still as Abby knelt to ease the wire away. Miguel jogged over from the fence crew to help, and within moments Maple was free, hobbling a few careful steps before lowering her head to graze. Abby straightened, brushing dirt from her palms, and looked at Cipher. He was standing a few yards away, his gaze fixed on Maple, as if making sure the crisis was over before he returned to Luna. "That's twice in one day," Miguel said quietly. "He's not just smart. He's watching everything." That night, Abby's journal entry sprawled across 2 full pages. She wrote down the sequence of events, the timestamps, the way Cipher's gestures had matched his intentions. She began thinking less like a trainer and more like an investigator. What patterns might emerge if she documented every anomaly? By the end of the week, the journal already held a dozen entries. Noticed volunteer carrying halter, moved to stall door before she arrived. Nudged water bucket toward Luna after she drank it dry. Positioned himself between Luna and noisy feed cart until it passed. Abby wasn't one to anthropomorphize. Years of working with Mustangs had taught her that the line between instinct and intelligence was often blurred. But Cipher was pushing her into unfamiliar territory. This wasn't random cleverness. It was observation, decision, and action, stacked in a way she hadn't seen in any horse, let alone a newborn. She didn't say much to the others beyond Helen and Miguel. The last thing she wanted was a parade of curious onlookers disrupting the barn's rhythm. But inside, her mind kept circling the same truth. This colt was different. Different enough to keep her up past midnight, turning pages in old animal cognition studies, wondering how far a mind like his could reach if given the right world to grow in, and if that world could be kept safe from the kind of attention that might take him away. Because already, she had a feeling that once word got out, people wouldn't just want to see Cipher. They would want to study him. And Cipher was hers to protect. By the end of the second week, Abby's leather-bound journal was already thick with entries, some hurried in the margins when she hadn't had time to sit at her desk. She had tried to keep Cipher's growing list of uncanny behaviors quiet, but Wild Haven was a small sanctuary in a smaller town. Volunteers talk, visitors talk more. And by the third weekend, Helen called Abby into the office with a look that said change was coming, whether she liked it or not. On the desk sat a manila folder stamped with the University of Nevada's crest. Helen slid a sheet across the wood. "Dr. Marcus Reed," she said. "Animal cognition research. His assistant emailed me last night. They want to visit." Abby read the letter twice. Dr. Reed's name was one she recognized. Papers on dolphin communication, primate problem-solving, even corvid intelligence. He wasn't some backyard self-proclaimed expert. He was the kind of scientist whose work got cited in textbooks. "They've heard something?" Abby asked carefully. Helen tapped the desk. "They heard enough to ask for a week here. Tests, observation, no invasive procedures. They say they'll keep the herd's routine intact." Abby's chest tightened. "You know what happens when people like him get interested. They'll want to take him." Helen's eyes softened but stayed steady. "That's why you'll be with them every step. You've been documenting more than most PhDs would manage in a month. We can't stop them from coming, but we can control the terms." The following Tuesday, 2 dusty SUVs rolled up the gravel drive, tires crunching in the thin frost. Out stepped Dr. Reed, tall, mid-50s, wiry build, sun lines around eyes that missed nothing. Behind him, a graduate student named Tessa carried a case the size of a guitar, and another assistant, Devon, pushed a cart loaded with oddly shaped boards, ropes, and sealed tubs. Abby watched from the corral fence as Reed approached Luna's stall. Cipher stood in the corner, ears pricked forward, eyes locked on the newcomers. Reed didn't stride in like most people would. He stopped a good 10 feet back, turning his body slightly sideways. Less threatening, Abby noted, and waited. Cipher studied him, then walked forward in an unhurried arc until they were a yard apart. The colt's nostrils flared, taking in the man's scent. Reed didn't reach out, only let Cipher close the gap on his own terms. "Well," Reed murmured, "aren't you something?" Over the next hour, they set up in the open pen just beyond the barn. The first puzzle was a simple feed box with a sliding lid, a trick usually taking an adult horse several minutes to figure out, if they ever did. Cipher nosed it once, then hooked his upper lip under the groove and slid it open. Tessa's eyebrows shot up. "That's fast." "Too fast for chance," Reed said, making a note. They moved on to a hanging ball with a rope dangling from it. Pulling the rope released a measured handful of pellets into a tray. Cipher inspected the setup from 3 sides before putting his teeth to the rope and tugging hard enough to get the food. He repeated it, this time with less force, adjusting to the resistance. Then came a shape recognition board. 3 large buttons, each marked with a different symbol: circle, triangle, square. Reed placed a small tub of grain behind a clear panel that would only unlock if the correct shape was pressed, as shown by a card held up beforehand. Cipher watched the demonstration once. When Reed held up the circle card, the colt nosed the circle button, then immediately looked to the panel to confirm it had opened. "Most horses can match after 50 or 60 trials," Devon said quietly. This was 1. Abby felt a twist in her gut. She was impressed. Who wouldn't be? But the efficiency in Cipher's choices unsettled her. He wasn't guessing. He was processing. The last test of the morning was the mirror. A full-length panel leaned against the pen's north fence, shrouded in a tarp. When they uncovered it, Cipher froze for a second, then stepped forward. Many horses either ignore mirrors or react as if meeting another horse. Snorting, posturing, sometimes challenging. Cipher did none of that. He tilted his head, ears swiveling, then looked behind the mirror, then back to the reflection. His lips twitched as if mimicking the movement he saw. Then, startling everyone, he reached out with his nose and touched a bright blue sticker Reed had placed on his own cheek earlier. Only now, on Cipher, it was stuck to the side of his jaw. The colt rubbed it off against the fence post without hesitation. "Self-recognition," Reed said under his breath. "Clear as I've ever seen it." By late afternoon, Cipher had solved every task they'd brought, some in ways the researchers hadn't anticipated. Tessa filmed the sessions, and Devon logged every motion, while Abby leaned against the rail, torn between pride and unease. When the team finally packed up for the day, Reed lingered by the pen, watching Cipher nudge Luna toward the water trough. "You've got something extraordinary here," he said to Abby. "I know," she replied. "And he belongs here." Reed smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll talk more about that." That night, Abby sat at her kitchen table, flipping back through her journal. The neat columns of time-stamps and behaviors now had a shadow behind them, a reminder that Cipher's brilliance, once seen, couldn't be unseen. And she had a feeling the real test was about to begin. Spring deepened into the kind of Nevada April that flips from dust to drizzle in the space of an afternoon. The cottonwoods along the creek wore new green, and the herd at Wild Haven spent more time in the larger pastures, tails flicking at the first flies of the season. Cipher had grown taller, his silver dapples stretching over longer legs, but his eyes, sharp, calculating, were unchanged. If anything, they seemed more focused now, as though he'd decided the world was a puzzle worth solving piece by piece. It started with the bell. One of the rehab pens had a feed bell hanging from the fence, a simple setup for horses recovering from injury, so staff could deliver hay on request without walking the length of the paddock. Pull the rope, the bell rings, and a volunteer comes with feed. Cipher had noticed it weeks earlier during a vet check for another gelding. Now, while grazing near the fence, he wandered over, nosed the rope experimentally, and rang the bell. Abby, mucking stalls nearby, turned at the sound. "You're not even in this pen," she called. But when she brought over a flake of hay for the injured gelding, Cipher stood by, watching intently as the food appeared. The next day, Abby caught him doing it again. Only this time, Luna was beside him. He rang the bell, stepped back, and nudged her toward the fence as the hay arrived. She ate first. Cipher didn't take a bite. Abby frowned. This wasn't random play. He seemed to be showing her the connection. Bell equals food. 2 days later, the proof came. Luna walked up to the rope and pulled it herself. Cipher stood a few feet away, ears forward, watching until the volunteer brought hay. He approached only after she had eaten for a while, as if confirming she understood the trick. Word of the bell training spread among the volunteers, and before long, Abby noticed him trying the same with 2 other foals in the pasture. His approach was deliberate. Demonstrate the action, wait, then physically guide the learner, sometimes by nudging their shoulder toward the rope, sometimes by blocking their path until they tried it. Helen leaned on the pasture gate one afternoon, eyes crinkled with something between amusement and awe. "He's teaching them. You know that, right?" Abby crossed her arms. "I know what it looks like." "It's more than that," Helen said. "He's watching for understanding. That's rare." Over the next weeks, the behavior became almost routine. A visiting group from a local school watched in fascination as Cipher coaxed a younger colt, Jasper, to ring the bell. Jasper's first attempts were clumsy. He'd paw at the rope or chew on the knot, but Cipher persisted, demonstrating again, then stepping back to let Jasper try. When Jasper finally managed a clear ring, Cipher gave a low nicker and walked away, head high. One of the chaperones whispered, "It's like he knows when they get it." Dr. Reed, who had extended his stay to continue observations, recorded the entire sequence from the fence line. Later, in the small office they used for reviewing footage, he showed Abby the playback. "Watch here," he said, pausing the video. "See how he adjusts his position? He's moving so Jasper's eyes are on the rope, not him. That's an advanced teaching strategy, reducing distraction to help the learner focus." Abby shook her head slowly. "I've never seen a horse do that on purpose." "That's because most don't," Reed replied. "This is what we call theory of mind. He understands that Jasper doesn't know something, and he's taking steps to change that." It was around this time that the sanctuary began getting more visitors than usual. Not just locals, but travelers who had read about the teaching colt in an online article. Helen kept them at a respectful distance, but even from across the pasture, people could see Cipher's unusual composure. He wasn't skittish like most young Mustangs. Instead, he'd stand in the center of the activity, eyes moving from horse to horse, as if taking attendance. One Saturday, a pair of geldings got into a shoving match near the water trough. Before Abby could get there, Cipher trotted over, not charging, not panicked, positioning himself between them and swinging his head in a slow, deliberate arc. The movement broke their focus. The geldings stepped back, snorting, and walked away. "That's the second time this week he's done that," Miguel said later. "It's like he's managing them." In the evenings, Abby's journal filled with more than just timestamps and behaviors now. She began to note the social context: who was present, what preceded the action, how the other horses responded. She saw patterns emerging. Cipher favored demonstration over repetition, would stop teaching if the learner showed signs of frustration, and seemed more invested in helping his mother and the younger foals than the older, more independent horses. Reed's team began cataloging these moments as well, building a data set they said could shift how animal learning was understood. Abby, meanwhile, guarded Cipher's routine fiercely. The more people who came, the more she worried about the wrong kind of attention, offers from private buyers, or worse, demands from institutions wanting to remove him for study. Late one afternoon, as the sky turned the color of tarnished copper, Abby leaned against the fence, watching Cipher and Luna graze side by side. The bell rope swayed in the breeze, untouched for the day. She could hear the low murmur of Reed's team discussing logistics behind her, but her eyes stayed on the colt. He glanced up, met her gaze for a long, unblinking moment, then lowered his head to take another mouthful of grass. She wrote that night, "He's not just learning, he's shaping the world around him." And Abby knew, deep in her bones, that the world would want to shape him right back. The Saturday crowd at Wild Haven was smaller than usual. A spring storm had been threatening all morning, pushing long clouds across the Nevada mountains and sending a restless edge through the air. Abby liked days like this, quieter, with fewer visitors leaning on the fences. The horses seemed calmer too, as if they understood they didn't have to be on display. Helen had just finished setting up a table of brochures in the visitor center when a man in his 40s stepped through the door with a boy trailing behind him. The boy's hands were shoved deep into the pockets of a navy hoodie, the hood pulled so far forward Abby could barely see his face. "Hi," the man said, giving a tentative smile. "We're the Moors. This is Ethan. We, heard about the sanctuary from a friend. Thought we'd visit?" Abby caught the slight hesitation in his voice, the kind that said there was more to the story. Helen greeted them warmly, but when she suggested the usual tour, the boy didn't move. He stayed rooted by the door, eyes down, rocking gently on his heels. Abby crouched slightly, keeping her voice low. "Hey, Ethan, would you like to see some of our horses from a little closer?" No answer, just the faintest flicker of his gaze toward her before it dropped again. Helen met Abby's eyes and gave a small nod toward the pasture. "Maybe start with Cipher," she said softly. The colt was grazing near the north fence, Luna beside him. The pasture was open and quiet, no other visitors on that side. Abby led the way slowly, letting Ethan and his father follow at their own pace. She didn't fill the silence. She'd learned a long time ago that some silences are necessary. When they reached the fence, Cipher looked up immediately. His ears tipped forward, and instead of bounding over like some young horses would, he began a slow, measured walk toward them. Abby noticed it right away. His head low, steps deliberate, eyes flicking between Ethan and the space around him. Cipher stopped a few feet from the fence, breathing quietly. Ethan's father started to say something, but Abby raised a hand gently to keep him from filling the moment. For a long beat, nothing happened. Then Ethan lifted his head, just enough for his eyes to meet Cipher's. The colt took one small step closer. Ethan's fingers twitched inside his hoodie pocket. "You can put your hand out if you want," Abby said, keeping her tone even. "He might sniff it." Ethan hesitated, then slowly pulled one hand free and extended it over the fence. Cipher leaned forward, lips barely brushing the boy's fingers before he exhaled a soft, warm breath. Ethan didn't flinch. He just stared, eyes widening slightly. Abby watched, hardly daring to breathe. For the next 10 minutes, Cipher stayed put, occasionally lowering his head to graze but always drifting back to stand near Ethan. When Luna wandered off toward the far end of the pasture, Cipher didn't follow. He stayed where he was. By the time they headed back toward the visitor center, Ethan's pace was quicker. He wasn't talking, but there was a lightness to his step that hadn't been there before. The Moors returned the next weekend. This time, Ethan walked ahead of his father to the pasture fence. Cipher spotted him from across the field and trotted over, slowing to that same measured walk as he got close. Abby saw Ethan's lips move, words she couldn't quite catch, as he reached through the fence to touch the colt's cheek. Over the next several visits, something began to change. At first, Ethan would only whisper to Cipher, narrating his movements in simple phrases. "He's eating. He's looking at me. He's shaking his head." Abby noticed that Cipher always adjusted, lowering his head when Ethan's voice was softer, stepping back slightly when the boy shifted his weight. By the 5th visit, Ethan had started speaking to Abby as well. "Does he like the rope?" he asked one afternoon, pointing to a lead rope coiled on the fence post. "He does," Abby said. "He's curious about anything new." Ethan nodded, then went back to watching Cipher with that intense focus Abby recognized all too well. It was the same way Cipher watched the world, absorbing, processing, without rushing to act. One afternoon, Helen joined Abby at the fence while Ethan stood a few yards away with Cipher. "He's different here," Helen murmured, watching the boy gently run his fingers along Cipher's mane. "Cipher matches him," Abby said. Slows down for him. Doesn't crowd him. Like he knows. Maybe he does. The following weekend, Ethan surprised them all. Cipher had been standing a little farther out in the pasture, grazing beside Luna. Ethan walked to the gate, opened it just enough to slip inside, and stopped a good 20 feet from the pair. Then, without calling or making any sound, he crouched slightly and held out a hand. Cipher's head came up immediately. He left Luna and walked straight to Ethan, stopping within arm's reach. The boy reached up, touching the colt's forehead, and for a long moment they stayed like that. Two still figures in the soft light of late afternoon. Abby wrote in her journal that night. Today, Cipher chose him over Luna. By early summer, Ethan was coming every weekend. He'd begun helping with small chores, filling water buckets, sweeping the aisle, and always ending his visit with a few minutes by Cipher's side. Abby started to see a quiet confidence in him, a steadier way of moving through the sanctuary. And each time she watched them together, she felt the same thing, like she was witnessing two minds tuned to the same frequency, meeting in the one place neither had to try so hard to be understood. August in the Nevada mountains was always dry, but this year the air felt brittle, like one hard wind could shatter it. The creeks had shrunk to thin threads, the grass in the pastures bleached to the color of old parchment. Abby had been watching the weather reports for weeks, heat advisories, low humidity warnings. But when the storm rolled in that afternoon, she knew the danger wasn't rain. It was the lightning. The first bolt split the horizon just after lunch, a jagged white vein running from the clouds into the far ridge. The thunder followed quick and sharp, shaking the barn windows. The horses shifted in their pens, ears swiveling toward the sound. By late afternoon, Helen's phone buzzed with the call they'd been dreading. A fire had sparked in the mountains west of Wild Haven, driven by erratic winds. The sheriff's voice over the line was tight. "It's moving fast. You've got a few hours, maybe less. Get your animals out." Abby didn't waste time asking questions. She grabbed the emergency binder from the office shelf and started calling volunteers. Miguel ran to hook up the trailers, tires spitting gravel as he backed them into position. Helen moved from stall to stall, haltering the most nervous horses first. Cipher was in the south pasture with Luna, grazing under the shade of a lone juniper. Abby jogged toward them, lead rope swinging from her fist. Even from a distance, she could smell the faint tang of smoke riding the hot wind. When she reached them, Cipher's head came up. His ears flicked toward the sound of the trailers clanking at the barn, then toward the faint, low-roar building in the west. He didn't shy or bolt, just watched her with that steady, searching look she'd come to know. "Come on, boy," Abby said, slipping the rope over his neck before haltering Luna. Back at the barn, the air was thicker, carrying a haze that stung her eyes. Volunteers were moving quickly now, loading horses two at a time. Some mares balked at the trailer ramps, hooves scrambling against the metal. Others froze entirely, eyes rolling white. That was when Abby saw Cipher do something she hadn't trained, hadn't even imagined. One of the younger mares, Maple, the same one he'd once alerted Abby to when she was tangled in the fence, stood rigid at her stall door, refusing to step into the aisle. Cipher, still on his lead rope, stopped beside her. He touched his nose to her flank, then stepped forward a few paces, glancing back over his shoulder. When she didn't move, he returned, nudging her again, this time toward the open door. "Easy, Maple," Abby murmured, realizing what he was doing. He tried again, more insistent, until Maple took a hesitant step, then another. With each step she made, Cipher moved ahead just far enough to keep her following, threading her straight to the waiting trailer. Miguel caught Abby's eye as he closed the ramp behind Maple. "You seeing this?" "Yeah," she said, her voice tight. "I'm seeing it." They worked faster now, Cipher moving at her side as she checked pens. Twice he pulled against the lead, not to run, but to guide her attention. Once toward a gelding that had sidestepped into a corner and was refusing to let a volunteer clip his halter, and once toward a water trough where a foal had slipped its head through the rail and gotten stuck. The sky to the west had turned the color of rust, the sun a pale disk in the smoke. The wind kept shifting, carrying sudden gusts that rattled the barn doors and made the horses flinch. Abby could feel the heat now, faint but growing, licking at the edges of the property. By the time the last trailer pulled out, the fire was visible in jagged flashes through the trees, a wall of orange leaping higher with each gust. Abby and Helen drove the final load down the gravel road, the tires crunching over embers that had drifted ahead of the flames. At the fairgrounds in town, the evacuees were met by a crew of volunteers and vet techs. Horses were unloaded into makeshift pens, given water, and checked for stress injuries. Cipher stepped off the trailer calmly, ears scanning the unfamiliar chaos. Trucks backing up, hoses running, people shouting instructions. He stayed close to Luna, but never once spooked. Later that night, after the fire crews had pushed the flames back from the sanctuary's boundary, Abby stood by Cipher's pen in the fairgrounds barn. He was eating, slow and deliberate, as if the day hadn't been anything more than a change in routine. But she knew better. She had seen the way he'd moved through that evacuation, not just following, but leading when it counted. Helen joined her, handing over a mug of lukewarm coffee. "We couldn't have done it that fast without him." Abby nodded. He knew. I don't know how, but he knew what to do. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the shuffle of hooves and the low murmur of other evacuees tending their animals. Outside, the smoke still hung heavy over the town, muting the stars. Abby made her final note of the night in her journal before heading to bed in the tack room. Cipher stayed calm throughout evacuation, actively guided panicked horses to exits, returned to help others after reaching safety. Leadership behavior, clear and intentional. She underlined the last 3 words twice, because tonight, in the middle of danger, Cipher hadn't just been smart. He'd been something more. The wildfire's heat still lingered in the Nevada air days after the flames had been pushed back. Wildhaven's pastures were streaked with blackened edges where the fire had licked too close, and the barn smelled faintly of smoke no matter how wide they left the doors open. The herd was back home, but the sanctuary's routine had shifted into something quieter, almost reverent, as if everyone, horses and humans alike, understood how close they'd come to losing it all. Cipher moved through it all with the same deliberate grace Abby had seen during the evacuation. But this time, the way people looked at him was different. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was awe. On the 3rd morning after the fire, Dr. Marcus Reed arrived unannounced. Abby spotted his SUV crunching up the gravel drive while she was refilling water troughs. She didn't even have to guess why he was here. Helen met him outside the office, arms crossed, shoulders squared. Abby stayed back, pretending to check a fence post, but straining to hear. "You saw what he did during the evacuation," Reed said without preamble. "I've had colleagues calling me since the news got out. This is unprecedented." Abby's logs alone would be enough to get him into a long-term cognition study. Helen's voice was steady. Cipher isn't going anywhere. Reed shook his head. You can't give him what we can. A controlled environment, access to specialized enrichment, 24-hour observation, the data we could gather. And what happens when your controlled environment starts feeling like a cage? Helen cut in. He's a herd animal. You take him away from his mother, his pasture. You change who he is. Abby stepped forward then, unable to stay silent. You've seen him here. Everything he's done, teaching, leading, it's because of this place, these horses. You take him away, you lose the thing you're trying to study. Reed turned to her, eyes narrowing just slightly. Abby, you've been his primary handler. You know how rare this is. Imagine what we could learn from him. Imagine what it could mean for how we understand animal intelligence. She didn't flinch. And imagine what it could do to him if you're wrong. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind rattling the burned leaves on the far fence line. Then Reed exhaled and said, I'm making a formal proposal. You'll have time to respond, but the offer will be public. This is bigger than just one sanctuary. He left without another word, the crunch of his tires fading down the road. By the next morning, the battle had begun. The local paper ran a story, Nevada's genius cult, science or sentiment, and the comments section lit up. Some readers sided with the sanctuary, praising Cipher's role in the evacuation and arguing that his welfare came first. Others demanded he be sent to the research facility, claiming it would be selfish to keep such a rare mind out of the scientific spotlight. Abby tried to ignore the noise, but it followed her into the barn. Volunteers asked about it in hushed tones. Visitors leaned over the fence, snapping photos and muttering about the famous horse. Even Miguel, who had been quiet since the fire, asked her one afternoon, You think they'll really try to take him? They can try, Abby said. But her grip on the pitchfork handle tightened until her knuckles ached. Helen called a meeting in the tack room that night. The air was thick with the scent of leather and hay as staff and a few trusted volunteers crowded in. They're serious, Helen said. Reed's proposal is already in the hands of the university board. If they decide to push it, we're looking at a legal fight. But I need to know where everyone here stands. The answers came fast and unanimous. Cipher stays. For the next week, the sanctuary became a rallying point. Animal rights groups posted online petitions. A wildlife photographer who had visited months earlier published a spread of images showing Cipher with Luna, his intelligence obvious even in still frames. Local families wrote letters to the editor, calling him Nevada's treasure. Reed's camp pushed back, releasing statements about the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity Cipher represented for cognitive science. They assured the public that his welfare would be a top priority and that the facility could replicate his herd environment. Abby read every word, then threw the paper into the trash. She knew what they couldn't replicate. The dust and sage smell of the Nevada wind, the way Luna's knicker sounded in the morning, the particular slope of the pasture where Cipher liked to stand and watch the horizon. Late one evening, after the last visitor had gone, Abby found herself leaning on the fence watching Cipher graze. The light was fading, painting his silver coat in shades of blue. Luna grazed a few yards away, tail flicking lazily. He lifted his head, meeting her gaze in that unblinking way that always made her feel like he knew more than she was saying. They want to take you, she said softly. But I'm not letting them. Cipher stepped closer, the grass still caught in his lips, and pressed his muzzle against her arm. She felt the warm exhale against her skin and thought of the wildfire, the way he had moved through chaos without fear, leading others to safety. If she had to fight to keep him here, she would, and she knew she wouldn't be fighting alone. Because by now, Cipher didn't just belong to Wild Haven. He belonged to everyone who believed that intelligence wasn't meant to be locked in a lab. It was meant to run free under the open sky. By mid-September, the battle over Cipher had grown far beyond the fence lines of Wild Haven. News crews had come and gone, leaving behind footage of his silver dapple coat gleaming in the Nevada sun, spliced between talking heads arguing about science, ethics, and the rights of animals. Abby hated every second of it. Cipher didn't care for the extra attention either. He'd taken to spending more time in the far pasture with Luna, where the cameras couldn't see him. Helen was on the phone constantly. Lawyers, reporters, animal welfare advocates. Abby kept her head down, focusing on the herd, but the tension was inescapable. It was there in the way volunteers spoke in clipped sentences, in the tight set of Miguel's jaw, in the polite but chilly emails from Dr. Reed's research team. Then, one Monday morning, Helen called Abby into the office. Her voice was low but urgent. "They've made a new offer." Abby didn't sit. "What kind of offer?" Helen leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "Reed says they'll drop the push to relocate Cipher if we allow them to build a research facility here, on-site. It would be fully funded by the university, but we keep ownership of Cipher and control over his care." Abby blinked. "Here? At Wild Haven?" "Exactly. They're proposing a state-of-the-art field research center. Enrichment areas, observation stations, testing setups, all within the sanctuary grounds. He stays with Luna and the herd. And you." Helen's mouth twitched into the faintest smile. "You'd be their official liaison." Abby sank into the chair across from her. "That sounds, better than the alternative. But what's the catch?" Helen didn't sugarcoat it. "It means a permanent presence here. Researchers, students, cameras. They'll want structured tests, data collection. We'll have to set hard boundaries to make sure it doesn't become an intrusion." For a moment, Abby pictured it. Cipher in his pasture. Still free to graze and teach and lead, but with a bank of cameras tracking his every move. The thought made her stomach twist. But then she remembered the wildfire and the way he'd guided Maple into the trailer. She thought of Ethan, who now came every Saturday and had started talking to the volunteers as easily as he talked to Cipher. Maybe letting the world watch wasn't the worst thing, if it meant Cipher stayed home. "What do you think?" Helen asked. "I think if it's the only way to keep him here, we take it. But I want it in writing. No forced isolation, no removing him from the herd, ever." Helen's smile widened. "Already on my list." The negotiations stretched over weeks. Abby sat in on every meeting, making it clear that Cipher's welfare came before any research goal. She fought for the right to veto any experiment she believed would stress him. She insisted the herd's pasture access remain untouched, and that all observation be done without disrupting daily routines. Dr. Reed, to his credit, agreed to more than she expected. "The point," he said during one video call, "is to see how intelligence develops and functions in a natural setting. If we remove him from that, we defeat our own purpose." By the first frost, the deal was signed. Construction began in October. Trucks rumbled up the gravel drive, delivering prefabricated panels, solar arrays, and fencing materials. The new research wing rose just beyond the main barn, a low, unobtrusive building with wide observation windows facing the largest pasture. Inside were temperature-controlled rooms for data analysis, storage for equipment, and a lab outfitted with interactive testing devices designed for equines. Cipher watched the process with the same measured curiosity he gave to everything. More than once, Abby caught him standing at the pasture fence, ears forward as workers hammered in the distance. Luna grazed beside him, unbothered, and eventually he'd drop his head back to the grass as if deciding it wasn't worth more thought. By November, the facility was ready. The researchers moved in gradually, careful not to overwhelm the herd. Abby introduced them to the daily routine: feeding schedules, turnout rotations, the subtle herd dynamics that kept peace among the Mustangs. She made it clear that Cipher wasn't a subject to be summoned on demand. If he didn't approach for a session, they'd try again another day. It didn't take long for Cipher to decide which sessions interested him. He seemed to enjoy the puzzle feeders most, not for the treats, but for the mechanics, testing the weight of levers, the give of sliding panels. Sometimes he'd solve a task in seconds, then repeat it slowly, as though demonstrating for the researchers exactly how it worked. Abby noticed him doing it once when Jasper, the young colt he'd taught to ring the bell, was watching from the fence. Reed called Abby into the observation room after that. He replayed the footage, pointing to the way Cipher glanced toward Jasper before slowing his movements. "You see it, right?" Reed said. Abby nodded. "He's teaching again." Outside the research world, the compromise was making headlines. Wild Haven became a symbol of collaboration between science and animal welfare. Visitors came not just to see Cipher, but to learn about the sanctuary's mission. Donations rose, and with them, the ability to rescue more Mustangs from auction lots and neglect cases. Ethan's father pulled Abby aside one Saturday as they watched Cipher and Luna by the creek. "You know," he said, "I think coming here, it's changed him. Not just because of Cipher, because he's part of something bigger now." Abby looked at Cipher then, his silver coat flashing in the low winter sun, head lifted toward the hills, and felt a swell of relief. He was still here, still free. The compromise hadn't been what she'd wanted at the start, but as Cipher trotted toward the herd, tail lifted high, she realized it might have been exactly what he needed. Because now the world could study him all it wanted, and he could still live under the wide Nevada sky that had made him who he was. Winter in the Nevada high desert was a quiet kind of beautiful. The snow didn't fall often, but when it did, it powdered the sagebrush and lay in delicate stripes along the ridges, making the mountains look like they'd been brushed with frost. The air was sharp enough to sting your nose, and the mornings came wrapped in silence, broken only by the nickers of the herd when Abby walked into the barn. It had been 3 months since the research center at Wild Haven opened, and Cipher had adapted to it like it had always been there. What no one had expected, not even Dr. Reed, was how quickly his behavior began to change once the new setup allowed for more structured observation. It started subtly. One morning, Abby noticed him flicking his tail 3 times in quick succession while standing a few yards from Luna. A moment later, Luna left her grazing spot and followed him toward the water trough. Abby wrote it off as coincidence, until it happened again the next day, and the next. Then came the follow me look. Cipher would raise his head, lock eyes with another horse, then swing his muzzle sharply in one direction. Almost without fail, the other horse would fall in beside him. Sometimes it led to a water break, sometimes to a patch of untouched grass. Sometimes it was to investigate something unusual, a new salt block, a jacket left hanging on the fence. Abby began noting each occurrence in her journal, labeling them with shorthand. FT, flicktail, FM, follow me. When she showed Reed her notes, his eyes lit up. These could be intentional signals, he said. Not just body language, but learned cues, maybe even a shared vocabulary. The research team set up observation posts near the pastures, logging every movement Cipher made. Within weeks, patterns emerged. The triple tail flick seemed to mean "come with me" when directed at Luna or another adult horse, but "move over" when aimed at a younger colt. A sharp stomp of his left foreleg, followed by a head toss, sent nearby horses into alert posture, ears pricked, bodies tense, like they were preparing for danger. One day in February, Abby watched something that took her breath away. A pile of fresh hay had been spread near the barn, and 3 horses moved in to eat. A younger mare, Willow, hovered at the edge, hesitant to push in. Cipher, who had been grazing farther out, approached, gave a short nicker, then lowered his head to the hay pile but didn't eat. He stepped aside, making space for Willow, and only began eating after she'd settled. Later, reviewing footage in the observation room, Reed pointed to Cipher's approach. See that head dip before he steps aside? That's not typical dominance behavior. It's an invitation, and she responds immediately. By early spring, the researchers had cataloged over 40 distinct signals: tail movements, ear flicks, vocalizations, head gestures, each with a context-specific meaning. The other horses weren't just reacting to his body language, they were learning from it. Jasper, the young colt Cipher had taught to ring the bell, began using a modified version of the "follow me" look with other foals. Luna herself adopted the tail flick when leading her son to shelter during a sudden hailstorm. The breakthrough came in March. A sudden gust of wind knocked over a stack of empty feed buckets near the barn, the clatter sharp enough to make several horses startle and trot away. Cipher, grazing with Luna and Jasper, gave a single sharp stomp followed by a low, rolling nicker. Both Luna and Jasper froze, ears swiveling toward him, and didn't move until the wind settled. That's a warning signal, Abby said, watching from the fence line. But it's not panic, more like hold your ground. The footage made its way into academic circles within weeks, sparking debates about whether this constituted a form of symbolic communication in horses. Reed was careful not to overstate it, but in interviews, he always came back to the same point. What we're seeing at Wild Haven is intelligence expressed socially, an individual shaping the behavior of an entire group through learned signals. For Abby, the science was fascinating, but what mattered more was what it meant for the herd. The Mustangs were more cohesive now, moving almost like a single organism when Cipher was with them. They grazed in tighter clusters, traveled in coordinated arcs to water, and seemed calmer in situations that would normally spook them. Even Ethan noticed. One Saturday afternoon, he stood beside Abby at the pasture fence, watching Cipher guide the herd toward the shelter as clouds rolled in. "He's talking to them," Ethan said quietly. Abby smiled. "Yeah, in his own way. What's he saying now?" She watched Cipher glance over his shoulder, ears flicking toward the wind, probably telling them to get inside before it rains. Sure enough, fat drops began to fall minutes later. By then, the entire herd was under cover. As spring settled over the Nevada mountains, the sanctuary began receiving international attention. Documentaries crews requested access. Scientific journals published preliminary findings from Reed's team. Donations poured in, not just for Wild Haven, but for other sanctuaries adopting similar field research models. But for Abby, the real reward came in the quiet moments, Cipher standing at the crest of the pasture. Tail swishing in slow arcs, eyes scanning the horizon, the herd unconsciously mirroring his stance. She wrote in her journal one evening, "Intelligence isn't just solving puzzles, it's knowing when to lead, when to teach, and when to simply be still so others can follow." Cipher wasn't just changing how science understood horses. He was changing how the herd understood itself. And maybe, Abby thought, how people understood them too. The first hints of summer came early that year. The Nevada hills traded their patchy green for a golden haze, and the mornings at Wild Haven started with the soft hum of bees moving through the sage. Cipher had grown into a striking 2-year-old, his silver dapples deeper now, his stride long and confident. He still carried the same measured focus that had defined him since birth, but there was an ease to him too, a quiet assurance that the sanctuary was his ground and the herd his to guide. The research center was busier than ever, but the work had shifted from testing Cipher's intelligence to documenting the changes he'd inspired in the entire herd. Dr. Reed's latest report detailed how other Mustangs were now using more than half of the signals Cipher had developed, an unprecedented example of social learning in horses. The findings were gaining attention not just from scientists, but from educators, therapists, and animal-assisted therapy organizations around the world. It was one of those groups that reached out to Helen with a proposal. They wanted to start a pilot program using rescued horses in therapeutic sessions for children and veterans, drawing on the model they'd seen at Wild Haven. Cipher would be the program's figurehead, not as a performer or a novelty, but as proof of what could happen when an animal's mind was nurtured, not contained. Helen brought the idea to Abby over coffee in the office one morning. "They're calling it Project Wild Mind," Helen said. "Sessions here at the sanctuary. No traveling, no taking him away from the herd, just building on what we already have." Abby didn't have to think long. If it helps people the way he's helped Ethan, I'm in. Ethan himself had changed more than anyone could have imagined since that first hesitant meeting at the fence. Now 13, he spent nearly every weekend at the sanctuary. He was comfortable around the volunteers, quick to share observations about the horses, and meticulous in his chores. His father often joked that Ethan had a better grasp of herd hierarchy than most adults. One Saturday in June, Abby watched from the barn doorway as Ethan led a small group of visiting kids through the pasture. Cipher trailed behind him, not because he was being led, but because he seemed to choose to follow. When one boy in the group hung back, looking nervous, Ethan slowed his own steps until Cipher caught up. The colt, though he was hardly a colt anymore, lowered his head to the boy's shoulder and stayed there until the boy reached up to touch him. Abby felt that familiar tug in her chest. Cipher wasn't just teaching horses anymore. The therapy sessions began quietly. Just a few local families and a handful of veterans referred by a nearby support group. The focus wasn't on riding, but on connection, learning to read a horse's body language, mirroring their movements, building trust without force. Cipher was often at the center, but never in a way that felt staged. Sometimes he'd approach a participant within minutes. Other times he'd hang back, letting another horse take the lead. Abby came to realize that even his absence was intentional, a choice to give someone space until they were ready. Word spread. Within months, the program was fully booked, and similar initiatives were popping up in other sanctuaries across the country. The Wild Haven model was studied, adapted, and implemented in places as far away as Scotland and New Zealand. For Abby, the most meaningful moments were still the smallest ones. Cipher standing perfectly still while a veteran brushed his coat for the first time in years. A child laughing out loud after learning how to ask him to walk beside them without a lead rope. Luna watching from the shade with the contentment of a mother who knew her son was safe. The media attention never fully went away. Documentaries were filmed, articles written, even a children's book published about the colt who talked. But Abby worked hard to keep the core of his life unchanged. He was never overworked, never paraded for cameras, and never treated as a possession. Cipher belonged to the herd, and by extension, to the wide Nevada sky. One warm evening in late summer, the sanctuary hosted its first public open house since the wildfire 2 years earlier. Families picnicked along the pasture fence. Volunteers gave tours, and Helen gave a short speech about the sanctuary's growth. When she invited Abby to speak, she kept it brief. "I could tell you about everything Cipher's done," she said, her voice carrying easily over the crowd. "How he's taught other horses, how he's helped people, how he's made us all think differently about what animals can understand. But the truth is, he did all of that just by being given the chance to be himself." She looked toward the pasture. Cipher stood at the crest of a small hill, the setting sun catching the silver in his coat. He glanced back at the herd grazing behind him, then toward the people gathered along the fence. For a moment, he was perfectly still, ears forward, the breeze tugging at his mane. Then, with the unhurried grace that had become his signature, he walked down toward them. Luna and Jasper falling into step behind him, as if drawn by a signal no one else could see. Later that night, after the last guests had gone and the stars had taken the sky, Abby leaned on the fence with Ethan beside her. Cipher was a dark shape against the lighter horizon, grazing in the quiet. "You think he knows?" Ethan asked. "Knows what?" Abby said. "That he's changed things. Not just here, everywhere." Abby watched the silver dapples shift in the moonlight. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think he knows." In her journal that night, she wrote the final entry she would ever make under the heading Cipher's Progress. He taught us that intelligence isn't measured by what you can take from someone, but by what you give them room to be. He led without forcing, helped without asking for anything back. And in doing so, he changed more than just our herd. He changed us. Cipher's story would go on to inspire programs, research, and policy changes for decades to come. But for Abby, his true legacy was simpler. Proof that every mind, no matter the species, deserves respect, freedom, and the chance to run beneath its own sky. Cipher's life at Wild Haven was more than the story of a remarkable horse. It was a reminder that intelligence comes in many forms, and that leadership, empathy, and understanding aren't traits reserved for humans. From the moment he opened a latch to help his mother eat, to guiding panicked horses through smoke and fire, to teaching both herd members and people without a single spoken word, Cipher showed that the most powerful kind of influence is quiet, patient, and rooted in trust. His journey proved that when we give another being, human or animal, the space to grow, the freedom to make choices, and the respect to be themselves, they can exceed every expectation we had for them. Cipher's world never shrank to fit inside a lab or a stall. Instead, it expanded outward, touching lives far beyond the Nevada pastures. The lesson is simple, but it's one worth carrying. Greatness doesn't come from control. It comes from connection. And when we choose to see every mind as worthy of that connection, we not only change their world, we change our own.